Arizona is about to do something that would have been almost unthinkable just a few years ago. It is preparing to take its own federal government to court, to sue the very institution that built its canals, filled its reservoirs, and made the modern state possible in a desperate fight over water. This is not a threat made lightly, and it is not the opening move in a negotiation. It is close to a last resort, the kind of thing a state does only when it feels it has been backed into a corner with no other way out. And to understand why Arizona has arrived at this extraordinary moment, poised on the courthouse steps against Washington itself, you have to understand a deal that Arizona made almost 60 years ago, back in the 1960s. It was a bargain that seemed brilliant at the time, a clever trade that built the Arizona we know today. But buried inside that deal was a hidden cost, a kind of time bomb with a very long fuse. And now, after decades of ticking quietly beneath the surface, that bomb has finally gone off. This is the story of the deal that built Arizona, the catastrophic flaw hidden inside it, and how it just exploded, driving an entire state to the brink of suing the country it belongs to. To understand the deal, you first have to understand Arizona's problem in the middle of the 20th century. The state was growing fast, its cities of Phoenix and Tucson swelling in the desert, and it desperately needed more water. It was legally entitled to a substantial share of the Colorado River, but there was a catch. The river ran along Arizona's western edge, far from where most of its people actually lived. The water was there, but it was in the wrong place. To get it to the growing heart of the state, Arizona needed to build one of the most ambitious water projects in American history, an enormous canal that would lift Colorado River water up out of its channel and carry it hundreds of miles across the desert, uphill all the way to Phoenix and Tucson. This project, the Central Arizona Project, would be the artery that fed the state's future, the thing that would allow the desert cities to keep growing. Without it, Arizona's share of the river was almost useless, tantalizingly close but forever out of reach. It is hard to overstate what an engineering marvel this canal would be. Water does not naturally flow uphill, and Phoenix and Tucson sit hundreds of miles inland and thousands of feet higher than the point where the canal would begin drawing from the river. To move the water, engineers would have to build a chain of massive pumping plants that would physically lift the river, stage by stage, thousands of feet into the air over the course of its journey, consuming enormous quantities of electricity to do so. The canal would snake across the desert like a man-made river, an open concrete channel shimmering in the heat, crossing some of the harshest terrain in North America. It would take many years and an immense national investment to complete. And when it was finished, it would stand as one of the largest and most expensive water projects ever undertaken in the United States, a testament to the sheer determination of a state that refused to accept the limits its geography had imposed. This was the prize Arizona was reaching for, and it was worth almost any price. That in the end is exactly the problem, because the price Arizona agreed to pay would turn out to be far higher than anyone in that era was willing to admit. But there was an enormous obstacle. A project of that scale, hundreds of miles of canals, tunnels, and pumping plants climbing thousands of feet in elevation, would cost a staggering amount of money, far more than Arizona could ever afford on its own. It needed the federal government to pay for it. And that meant it needed the approval of Congress, where California, Arizona's rival on the river, and a far more powerful political force, stood firmly in the way. California had no interest in helping Arizona build a canal that would let it draw more heavily on a shared river. For years, California used its political muscle to block the funding, and Arizona's dream of the Great Canal languished, going nowhere. Arizona was stuck. It could not build the project without federal money, and it could not get federal money without getting past California. And California was not going to move for free. So in 1968, Arizona made a fateful choice, the choice that would haunt it for generations. To break the deadlock and finally win the federal funding for its canal, Arizona agreed to a devastating concession. It agreed that the water flowing through its new Central Arizona project would be legally junior to California's water rights, in the strict hierarchy that governs the Colorado River, where older and more senior rights are satisfied first. Arizona accepted that its canal would sit near the very bottom of the priority ladder, at least relative to California. This meant that if the river ever fell short and cuts had to be made, the water in Arizona's Great Canal would be among the very first to be reduced, sacrificed to protect California's more senior claims. It was the price of admission. California agreed to stop blocking the project. Congress approved the funding, and construction of the canal could finally begin. Arizona got its water highway. But it got it by mortgaging its future, by accepting a subordinate status that would lie in wait for decades. Now, it is important to understand why Arizona made this deal, because from the perspective of the 1960s, it was not nearly as reckless as it looks today. At that time, the Colorado River seemed abundant. The great reservoirs were filling or full. The devastating droughts of the 21st century were unimaginable. And the idea that the river might one day fall so low that Arizona's junior water would actually be cut to nothing seemed like a distant, almost theoretical worry. Arizona's leaders made a calculated bet. They reasoned that a junior right to a vast amount of water, delivered by a canal that would transform the state, was far better than a senior right to no canal at all. They were betting that the river would remain generous enough that the subordination would never really bite, that the fine print they were signing would never actually be enforced against them in a serious way, that scarcity was someone else's problem in some far-off future. And for a long time, that bet looked like a winner. The canal was built, the water flowed, and Phoenix exploded into one of the largest and fastest-growing cities in the country, a gleaming metropolis raised in the desert on the promise of that Colorado River water. But the deal Arizona signed was a time bomb, and the fuse was the level of the river itself. As long as the Colorado ran high, the subordination sat quietly, harmless, a piece of legal fine print that never had to be invoked. But it was always there, waiting. And beginning around the turn of the century, the fuse began to burn. A punishing, relentless drought, the worst the region had seen in over 1,000 years, and made hotter and drier by a changing climate, settled over the basin and refused to leave. Year after year, the river's flow dwindled, and the great reservoirs that fed the canal, chiefly Lake Mead, began to fall toward levels never seen before. And as the river shrank, that old 1968 bargain, dormant for so long, began to stir to life. Because Arizona's canal held junior rights, it was legally first in line to absorb the cuts. The very subordination that had seemed like harmless fine print in an age of plenty was now transformed by the shrinking river into the mechanism that would force Arizona to give up its water before almost anyone else. The consequences were brutal and immediate. As the shortages deepened, Arizona was forced to shoulder cuts far out of proportion to its size, absorbing the great majority of the early reductions demanded of the lower stretch of the river, precisely because of that junior status. The pain landed first and hardest on the farmers of the state's central valleys, whose access to canal water was slashed dramatically, forcing many to fallow their fields or fall back on pumping groundwater from beneath their land. A stopgap that only deepens another crisis. The engine of Arizona's growth was being throttled by a deal its own leaders had signed half a century earlier. Consider what that actually meant on the ground for the farmers who bore the first blows. For decades, the agricultural communities in the central part of the state had built their entire livelihoods around the water the canal delivered, planting thousands of acres of cotton, alfalfa, and other crops, investing in equipment and land, and a whole way of life premised on that water continuing to flow. Then, almost overnight in agricultural terms, a large share of that canal water was taken away, cut to protect the more senior users and to prop up the falling reservoir. Farmers who had counted on the canal were suddenly left scrambling, forced to leave fields bare and unplanted, to sell off equipment or to drill ever deeper wells and pump groundwater from beneath their own land at great expense. But that groundwater is itself a finite, dwindling resource already overdrawn in many places. So trading canal water for well water simply shifts the crisis from one account to another, borrowing against an even more fragile future. Entire farming communities that had thrived for generations found their foundations knocked out from under them. And the ripple effects spread through local economies, through the businesses and towns that depended on a healthy agricultural base. This was the human face of the 1968 subordination finally coming due. And still the river kept falling, and still the cuts grew deeper, until the situation reached a breaking point in the summer of 2026, when the bomb that had been ticking since 1968 finally fully detonated. What lit the final fuse was a sweeping plan released by the federal government to manage the shrinking river through the next decade, with the 7 states of the basin unable to agree among themselves on how to share the pain. The federal government stepped in and imposed its own framework. And when Arizona looked at that plan, it saw catastrophe. The plan required the lower stretch of the river, Arizona chief among them, to absorb enormous cuts, while the states in the upper part of the basin faced no mandatory reductions at all. Worse, because of Arizona's junior status, it would bear a wildly disproportionate share of those cuts, far more than its neighbors. Under some of the scenarios that had been considered, the situation was nothing short of existential. Officials warn that certain alternatives could essentially dry up the Great Canal itself, the very lifeline that carries water to Phoenix and Tucson. One coalition defending the state's water put it in the starkest possible terms, warning in a public campaign that the federal approach could wipe Arizona off the map. The 1968 deal had come due, and the bill was the future of the state. Arizona's response has been a fury that crosses all the usual political divides. Leaders from across the spectrum, who agree on almost nothing else, have come together to denounce the federal plan as fundamentally unfair, as singling out Arizona for punishment while sparing others. And crucially, the state has been quietly preparing for war in the courtroom. For more than a year, Arizona's leadership has been assembling a legal war chest, setting aside millions of dollars specifically to fund litigation over the river, and signaling that it is ready to fight for its water in court if a fair deal cannot be reached. The state has made clear that it is prepared to sue not just rival states, but the federal government itself if it believes the imposed plan violates Arizona's rights or the law of the river. This is the extraordinary moment the state now faces. A bipartisan willingness to take Washington to court over the water that keeps the state alive, driven by the detonation of a deal signed nearly 6 decades ago. It helps to understand what such a lawsuit would actually argue, because the legal theories reach beyond just the 1968 bargain. One central line of attack would target the century-old compact that first divided the river, and specifically the obligation it places on the upper basin states to deliver a certain minimum amount of water downstream over time. Arizona and its lower basin neighbors could argue that as the river shrinks, the upstream states must bear some of the burden of maintaining those deliveries rather than leaving the downstream states to absorb every cut. Another line of attack would challenge the federal government's authority to impose a plan that Arizona never agreed to, arguing that the framework unfairly and perhaps unlawfully singles the state out for disproportionate harm. A dispute of this kind, between states over a shared river, would most likely land directly before the nation's highest court, which has the power to hear such interstate water conflicts. But that path is treacherous. A case before the Supreme Court over the fundamental meaning of these old agreements could take many years to resolve, and the outcome would be deeply unpredictable, because these compacts have never been fully tested under conditions this extreme. Arizona could win big, or it could lose catastrophically, having gambled its water future on the judgment of a court that no one can predict. That uncertainty is precisely why litigation has always been considered the option of last resort, the thing everyone hoped desperately to avoid. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how drastic the option of suing the federal government really is, because the federal government is not merely an opponent here, it is also Arizona's partner and benefactor. It was the federal government that built the canal in the first place, that funds and operates much of the water infrastructure the state depends on, that manages the dams and reservoirs of the entire river. Suing that same government is a little like suing the bank that holds your mortgage and also happens to control the water main to your house. It is a nuclear option fraught with risk, because litigation over something as fundamental as the Colorado River could drag on for years, even decades, and a court could rule in almost any direction, potentially upending arrangements that entire cities have been built upon. Everyone involved understands that a lawsuit is a gamble with enormous stakes and deeply uncertain odds. That Arizona is seriously contemplating it anyway is a measure of just how cornered the state feels and how completely the old deal has blown up in its hands. It is worth being precise about where things actually stand, in fairness to the facts. As of now, Arizona has not yet filed its lawsuit. What exists is a state armed, angry, and openly prepared to sue, with the money set aside and the legal teams assembled, hoping even at this late hour that the mere credible threat of a courtroom battle might force a fairer outcome at the negotiating table. The federal plan itself is designed in part as a temporary framework, leaving a narrow door open for the states to keep talking. So this is a state cocked and ready to fire, rather than one that has already pulled the trigger. And that distinction matters, because it means there may still be a path, however narrow, that leads somewhere other than the courthouse. Now, in fairness, it would be a mistake to paint Arizona simply as a victim, because the other side of this dispute has serious and legitimate arguments too, and honesty requires acknowledging them. California can point out correctly that Arizona agreed to the subordination freely, that it knew what it was signing in 1968, and that senior water rights are the bedrock of the entire system of Western water law, the foundation everyone relies on for stability. To simply tear up that seniority now, California would argue, because it has become painful for Arizona, would throw the whole system into chaos. The states in the upper basin, for their part, argue that they have their own protections under the century-old compact that governs the river, that they have historically used far less than their share, and that they should not be forced to cut water they were legally promised to rescue the fast-growing cities downstream. And the federal government would say that with the states hopelessly deadlocked and the reservoirs in freefall, it had no choice but to act, that someone had to impose order before the whole system crashed. There are no simple villains here. There is a shrinking river, a set of century-old and decades-old agreements, colliding with a reality none of their authors imagined, and a group of states each convinced, with real justification, that it is being asked to sacrifice unfairly. The stakes in this fight could hardly be higher, because it is not just about abstract legal principles. It is about the water that sustains one of the fastest-growing regions in the entire country. If Arizona's junior canal were cut severely, or dried up altogether under a worst-case scenario, the consequences would ripple through millions of lives, threatening the water supply of major cities, crippling a vast agricultural sector, and undermining the economy of a state that has boomed for decades. And beyond Arizona, this dispute carries a danger for the entire basin, because if Arizona actually files suit, it could trigger the very thing that everyone in the region has long dreaded, a sprawling, multi-front legal war over the Colorado River that could consume years, poison relationships between the states, and freeze cooperative action at the exact moment the crisis demands it most. A lawsuit by Arizona could be the spark that ignites a courtroom battle up and down the river, with every state and interest scrambling to defend its own claims. It is a prospect that terrifies even those who believe Arizona has been genuinely wronged. So what is the deeper lesson buried in all of this? It is a lesson about the hidden dangers of the bargains we strike in times of plenty. In 1968, Arizona made a deal that looked, by the logic of its era, entirely sensible. It traded away a piece of its future security, its water priority, in exchange for something it desperately wanted in the present: the canal that would build its cities. It was a mortgage taken out against a future that seemed safely distant and abundant. But abundance is not permanent, and the future always arrives. The drought came, the river shrank, and the mortgage payment that had seemed so manageable, so theoretical, suddenly became crushing. The choices a society makes in its confident growing years, the corners it cuts, and the risks it accepts, do not simply vanish. They wait, quietly, until the conditions change, and then they come due, often at the worst possible moment, and often for a generation that had no part in making them. In the end, Arizona now stands at the courthouse door, holding a contract nearly 60 years old that has just exploded in its hands. Whether it ultimately files suit, or whether the pressure of that threat forces a new and fairer deal at the negotiating table, the old world is gone for good. The comfortable fiction that the 1968 bargain was a costless masterstroke, that Arizona had cleverly gotten its canal for free, has been shattered by the falling river. The bill has finally arrived, and it is enormous, written in the currency of the state's most precious resource. One way or another, in water given up, or in years of costly litigation, or in both at once, Arizona is going to pay it. The deal that built the state has become the deal that threatens to break it, and an entire population now waits to see whether their leaders can find a way through, or whether the great canal that made modern Arizona possible will become the battleground on which its future is decided. The bong has gone off. Now Arizona must live in the wreckage and decide what to build next. And whatever it decides, the rest of the thirsty West will be watching very closely, because the same reckoning, in one form or another, is coming for them all.